Welcome to the Gifted in Real Life podcast, where we talk about all things gifted learners and gifted individuals. Today, we have a special treat for you. We have Gloria Jensen, who coaches adults who are gifted and who have that emotional intensity that we are so familiar with. I'm so excited for this conversation today. And so let's just get started. Gloria, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
All right, so let's just get started. Would you mind starting by giving us an introduction to who you are and what it is that you do?
Yes, would love to do it. So you will very quickly hear that I have an accent, so that I'm not American. I grew up in France with German-speaking parents, and I lived as well in Germany, and later in life as well in England, in Australia, now in the United States. So I would say often when I first describe myself, I talk about this multicultural part, which plays a huge role in my life and also in how I approached life. That created really an open mind, I would say, an open-minded person. And I am a coach, so as you said, specialized in supporting gifted and talented adults. I do, because of this international perspective, work in English, in French, and in German. And I love also to approach giftedness from this, the more European perspective than the more American, learning all the time how we see giftedness and how we talk about the giftedness and how we handle this topic in different kinds of environments. For me, really, what I do is about helping gifted adults to understand themselves, honor their needs, and create a life that reflects who they are and what they want to do, which is often an atypical path, I would say.
All right. So I'd like to start by asking a question from what you just said. So right off the bat, what do you think are some of the biggest differences between the perspective, I guess a European perspective of giftedness versus an American perspective?
So the very interesting part is, I would say, so I'm European, and often from Europe, we look at the United States saying like, oh, you are so advanced, so evolved on these topics. So we kind of often say like, they already do it, they already have integrated that topic. And then when I arrived in America, I said, well, actually not exactly. So it is a topic. Some states are more advanced than others. But it's not, we had such an idealized perspective on the United States. So I'm getting now to experience the reality. And I would say of course, I can't talk for entirely Europe because I didn't live in all of these countries, but I would say, depending on which country and on the culture, for example, if I take France, one of the biggest value of you always talk about equality, and it's difficult to then talk about differences, uniqueness, when, especially from an educational perspective, you want to approach every child in the same way. And so it can be a difficult topic to talk about. And I would say more generally, like in Europe, we have a lot of misunderstanding and misconception of what means giftedness. A very, I would say, also official-based approach when I say this is we have this, the test, the IQ test, the VICE test, and many people say, well, that's the only way to validate giftedness, but then there are people who don't fit the test, and there is still, I would say, not enough discussion and debate around what means giftedness. How do we test it? How do we validate it? And for what I feel, at least, and you will probably tell me if you see this way, there is more openness in America and to think about what it means giftedness and maybe to approach it in a more rich and complex way. Yeah, would be curious about how you feel about it as well.
Well, my opinion on that is that I think maybe compared to what other countries have done. There is more discussion about it. However, I still think that the depth of conversation is hugely lacking. I think we pay a lot of lip service to gifted education, but I really think that one of the biggest problems is we don't have a standard for it, like a standard way that we operate when we're working with gifted learners. For example, it varies from district to district, and even within a district, it can vary from school to school. It depends on the values of the school administrator, how much they value it, how much they know about it, and how much they're willing to put behind it as far as resources and making sure that teachers are trained on giftedness. At the collegiate level, there's not a lot of emphasis given to it. Even if you go through a teacher ed training program, it might be mentioned, there might be a class here and there, but it's not very evolved. And we live in a time where there are a lot more people that we know have neurodiversity, even if they're not gifted, even if they just have learning disabilities. That all falls into the same category as far as I'm concerned, because learning is on a spectrum, right? You have people who are extremely intelligent, and then you go from here. Not to say that people over here aren't extremely intelligent, but if we're going to talk about numbers and IQs, there is a range there. And I think that if we could do a good job of, let's say we do have a test that we use on everyone, it cannot be the only measure, because someone who is highly intelligent may not be a good test taker. They might overthink. Like for me, I'm very inconsistent when it comes to taking tests, because I do overthink things. And if I didn't have a tendency to do that, I probably would do better. But I need qualifiers like, well, if that depends, this could be this answer, but maybe not. And so giftedness is not just about an IQ score. It's about a personality. It's about the way that a person thinks and sees the world. And I think that if we approached it where we give people like an individual learning plan, we can catch and help everyone, not just gifted people. They need the help. But I think that we would do ourselves a service if we gave everybody an individual learning plan where we gave the child an opportunity to lead their education more and to learn from their peers, and have the teachers sort of be a guide, so they don't have to feel overwhelmed that they have to do, let's say they have 25 kids. You don't have to do 25 different lesson plans for each kid to have an individual learning plan. There are just things that we can do, I think, to sort of have a different way of approaching these individuals that's not traumatizing, because it can be for kids in school. They're just so misunderstood. So I think that maybe the differences aren't as broad. I mean, we seem to be more open-minded over here, but when the rubber meets the road, I'm curious to see how much it translates into something, into the kids getting what they actually need, right? Because it's not just about somebody's IQ, it's about you going from your point A to your point B to your point C and all the way to Z and beyond. What is going to help you to meet potential that you have?
It's very interesting because, just the fact that I mentioned this question of testing and validating giftedness already shows you where we are stuck. And at least from what I get, for example, for France or other countries, is many people don't really go into the topic because they are kind of stuck at this stage of validating it. And then we talk about this, but actually it's exactly what you said, like the interesting path is after, like, how do you honor these needs? How do you fulfill your potential? So all this is then the interesting path. And if we would probably really work more around that, we could be able to approach this topic in a better way.
Yeah. So, so what sort of led you down this path on working with gifted individuals? What's your backstory with that? When were you introduced to this concept?
So I would say very lately, actually. I had I'm often super comprehensive about the misunderstandings around giftedness, because myself, I had a completely wrong representation of what it means to be gifted. I was super ignorant. Like, let's make it simple. It's often ignorance that brings us to misunderstand things. And I would think, oh, okay, a gifted person is a genius. It's someone from another world. I don't know anyone who is gifted. And so that was kind of a picture I had in my mind, and I would never identify with it. And then actually through a friend, I heard about this topic. And first, I just read a book, which is quite a common book about the topic. And
What's the book, if you don't mind sharing?
it's a French book, so I guess for Americans, the person won't be well known, but it's one of the authors in France, which is very visible on the topic. Her name is Monique de Carnandec. And so I read the book, and I had this very weird relationship just to the book, because I didn't know anyone who was gifted. I just had this book and discovering the topic and reading, and as many other people, like, oh wow, that resonates with me, but I can't be gifted, because then you have to imagine always like the stories, and then you have the representation of what it means to be gifted in my mind, but it's not the reality. And so I was like, really it was quite difficult and challenging emotionally and mentally, because I didn't know what does that mean, how should I move forward. No, that's not me. So I was really reading, and at the same time wanted to throw the book in the bin, because I felt so alone with the topic. And it's really much later that I discovered, like, online there are so many resources, there are so many things you can discover, but at that time I didn't have I would say the access or the awareness of what was
the language for it.
And it's after I finished the book, I was like, okay, I waited a few months, like, okay, I need to go into that deep. I need now to talk to a professional. And that's actually how the story started. And I started to talk with psychologists and coaches who were specialized in the topic. And it's really was a process that took time. I often say, like, giftedness takes time to be integrated. Like, it doesn't happen overnight. And after I had talked and I got the support and I did the path for myself, at the same time I decided to, it was really very intuitive, actually. Probably a bit crazy when you look at it from the outside, but very quickly I decided to get a specific training into giftedness, which would help me to support gifted adults. And I was thinking,
the same thing.
Yeah. Well, so
certification, I have an executive function certification. I did the same thing.
So I was like, I'm going to do it. I don't know if I will work with gifted people, but I wanted to go into depth in the topic. I wanted to have experts in front of me with whom I could talk, and other peers who were interested by the topic, so that I got a direct access to the community to ask all my questions, to have a sounding board, like, because I felt so alone with the topic before, I didn't know with whom to talk. So and that's really, I think that's a shifting point for me. When I did this training, I really get a deep and new and complete understanding of giftedness. And then, of course, that after was enriched by the fact that I decided to support gifted adults, and through all the coaching sessions, whether it's individually, I support also groups, my picture got even richer and wider.
I'm glad you said that, because as you were saying that you got coaching or training or education about gifted individuals, I want to make this point to listeners that the education around what giftedness is and how to navigate life as a gifted person will be a lifelong journey. Like, I think new discoveries will be made about how the brain works all the time and the way that it translates, because just as many people as there are in the world who are gifted, no two people are the same. Like, there are commonalities, there's some overlap, but it can be very elusive. And I think people need to just make sure that they keep in the back of their mind that you're not going to have this totally figured out ever. So you need to keep an open mind and be flexible. I think flexibility is key, and always, like, seeking information, not just information, but good, credible information and community, I think is key. Being around other individuals who think the way you do, because giftedness is lonely. It's lonely. It can be really lonely, in my opinion.
I love your perspective. Really, I love the fact that you emphasize this lifelong process. I often say, of course, I have expertise in giftedness because of my trainings before, because of my experience, that's for sure. But I'd never, and for me, it makes really no sense when we work with gifted adults to say like, oh, you know, I'm above, I have the expertise. I'm more like, okay, let's share. I can give you my perspective, my experience, but I want to feel and hear how you feel about it. Because it's, yes, we have scientific research, but we know there is so much more to be discovered. So it's a field that is still very open. And so for me, it's super important that people understand, and especially then when you go into twice exceptionality, that not all the answers are not with the experts. Like you will find your way, and you will probably bring as well through your life and your experiences a lot to experts as well. So it's a movement. It's not like from
it's
up
a
to down.
carousel and not a straight line.
Yeah.
Yes. So talk to me about your education. When you were pursuing places to learn more about giftedness, what did you end up finding, and what was that process like for you?
So when you say education, do you mean like when I was a child or now?
No,
Like as an
well,
adult?
not just yet. I will ask about that, but I mean as an adult, just as you were describing,
Yeah.
learning more. Was it formal, self-taught, a combination of both?
A combination of both. You can imagine that, because we often, as gifted people, we like as well to do our own research, and so that we create our own map. And so I would say my education around giftedness, like many people would be, I've been reading, and I'm still always, I would love to have even more time to read books. So like books were a huge inspiration. Then like online, there is really a lot. And that's the thing. You have to imagine that I'm reading these books and discovering all the resources online after having done a training. So I have a foundation that is super healthy, because that's the issue. When you discover, you might read things that actually give you a wrong perception or limitate yourself, because that's for me, that's a huge engagement I have, is that people integrate giftedness in a way that it's liberating them. Because many gifted adults come to me and say, well, you know, I have a very negative perspective on giftedness, or I don't like this part of myself, or a lot of limiting beliefs, which is a construct because of maybe what they read, and which was sometimes not very scientifical. And then they create a perception that is really limiting themselves. So I would say, so keep in mind when I share what my path is, like I had a structure, like a foundation through my training that I did with an expert in giftedness. And then that was my foundation. And then myself through books, online resources, my clients, of course, as well, the exchange I have with them, I created and developed my expertise. And I often say, that's why I'm connecting back to what I just said just before. Today, I'm like, we don't have a school or a certificate, a training program where you could learn about giftedness, then about ADHD, about autism, about like all these twice exceptionalities. We as professionals, we have to go and pick the knowledge in different places and make sense of it. At least for adults, that's what I know from all these topics for adults. I've heard for education, it's a bit different. There are some programs in the United States, but so it's all of that. It's it's a field that is still unfolding, and I like to emphasize this.
So I just want to say something about what you just said about how you mentioned giftedness, ADHD, and autism. So, do you know that a lot of the markers or the indicators or the symptoms, whatever you want to call those, for those three diagnoses are so similar? In some cases, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between someone who's gifted, ADHD, or has autism, high functioning. It's almost impossible. Um, and so I think that, like in my educational journey for giftedness, when I learned something, like when I learned that, I said to myself, okay, so what's important here is that we come up with the solution for the challenge that this person is having, more so than making the distinction, because we really don't know. I think that's something that can evolve and unfold over time. Meanwhile, what do we do for this person? And my focus has definitely been more on children because I'm an educator. But giftedness, I want to say this, is highly hereditary. And I can name off people in my family that I know are gifted. Um, but I mean, not all of them are, but I have an uncle who was, he recently passed away, and I would have loved to have had him on my podcast. It's been less than a year. My mom, my brother, my sister, my children, my husband, even people who are gifted tend to be attracted to each other. And I've said this before on the podcast, like from a relational standpoint, like from friends to romantic partners. Some of my friends, some of my girlfriends have children who are gifted. Like I can think of 3 of them. And like it just goes on and on. And sometimes they're identified, sometimes they're not. And when you're not, and you learn that you might be, a lot of people's first instinct is to deny it, to be in denial, because they think you're supposed to be like supernatural or superhuman. But it's not different for you because it's you, like it's your normal. And so a lot of people are talked out of it. Like, well, I'm not gifted. Or like you were saying, they have this perception about it that society has placed on it. It's kind of like what people do to wealthy people. Like you're bad because you're wealthy, or you're bad because you're really smart. And that's so unfair and so inaccurate, where I think we need to be more open to looking at what the symptoms are and, approaching people as individuals and meeting them where they are.